For more than half a century, no human being left low Earth orbit, not once. The longest pause in human exploration since exploration began. And then, 4 days ago, it ended. A rocket carrying 4 people tore through the Florida sky and pointed itself at the moon. Artemis 2 is not a repeat of Apollo. It is not a sequel. The crew flying right now, Reid Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen, are doing things inside that spacecraft that the Apollo astronauts couldn't have imagined. Some of what they're experiencing would have looked like science fiction to the engineers of 1972. So what changed in 50 years? Almost everything. Start with the spacecraft itself. The Apollo Command Module gave its 3-person crew around 210 cubic feet of living space. That is roughly the interior of a large closet. 3 grown men sealed inside a closet for up to 14 days. Orion gives its 4-person crew 330 cubic feet, nearly 60% more room. Still tight, still claustrophobic by any reasonable standard. But the difference between a closet and 2 minivans parked side by side matters enormously when you are 250,000 miles from the nearest hospital and haven't been able to stretch your legs in a week. The extra space isn't just about comfort, it changes what the crew can actually do. Orion has a dedicated hygiene area with doors that close. There is a proper toilet, nearly identical to the one on the International Space Station, collecting waste separately and processing it with the one thing the Apollo crews never had: privacy. The Apollo astronauts used adhesive plastic bags, taped to their bodies, used in full view of each other, then sealed and stored inside the cabin for the rest of the mission. Nearly every Apollo astronaut who has spoken honestly about it describes it as one of the worst parts of the entire experience. The Artemis 2 crew will never know that particular indignity. And honestly, that alone might be worth the 53 years of waiting. Then there is exercise. Apollo astronauts didn't exercise in space. There was no room, no equipment, and on missions shorter than 2 weeks, NASA decided the muscle and bone loss was acceptable. The Artemis 2 crew exercises every day, 30 minutes on a device called a flywheel. It weighs around 30 pounds and fits in the space of a carry-on suitcase. It works like a yo-yo, a cable mechanism that provides resistance proportional to the force applied, up to 400 pounds. You can row on it, you can squat, you can deadlift. For comparison, the exercise equipment aboard the International Space Station weighs over 4,000 pounds and takes up 850 cubic feet. The flywheel does much of the same work in a fraction of the mass. Apollo had nothing. The crews came home weak. Some could barely stand. The Artemis 2 crew will return having done deadlifts in zero gravity on their way to the moon. A sentence that would have sounded completely absurd to anyone alive during Apollo. The rocket that carried them there is a different machine too. Apollo flew on the Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever launched at the time, producing 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. The Space Launch System that carried Artemis 2 off the pad on April 1st produces 8.8 million, 17% more. Both are expendable, which feels almost quaint in an era when SpaceX lands boosters on drone ships. But SLS wasn't built to be economical. It was built to throw Orion and its crew toward the moon in a single launch. No orbital assembly required, no refueling, no docking needed before leaving Earth's neighborhood. Saturn V did the same thing. The difference is what sits on top. Apollo ran entirely on fuel cells and batteries. Hydrogen and oxygen combined to make electricity, with drinking water as a useful byproduct. Elegant, but finite. Every watt the crew used came from a tank that was getting emptier. Orion unfurls 4 solar array wings after reaching space, each covered in photovoltaic cells converting sunlight into electricity. For all practical purposes, the power supply is unlimited, as long as the sun is shining. This changes the psychology of the mission in ways that are easy to underestimate. Apollo crews were always managing consumables, always aware of the clock running down on their power, their oxygen, their water. Orion's crew still tracks consumables. Solar panels don't produce air, but the electrical margin is fundamentally different. Systems can run longer, harder, with more redundancy because the power source regenerates itself. And the service module, the section providing propulsion, thermal control, and life support, wasn't even built in America. It was built by Airbus Defence and Space in Europe, provided by the European Space Agency. Apollo was an American project from the rivets up. Artemis is international by design. A Canadian astronaut is on this flight because of a treaty signed in 2020. European hardware is keeping the crew alive. The next phase involves the Lunar Gateway, a space station in lunar orbit with modules contributed by multiple countries and agencies. The era of one nation going to the moon alone ended when Apollo ended. Now look at the computers. Orion's flight systems are roughly 20,000 times faster than Apollo's guidance computer. Apollo had around 72 kilobytes of memory and could execute 40,000 instructions per second. A modern smartphone embarrasses it. Orion runs 4 independent computers in parallel, each around 400 times faster than the space shuttle systems. The cockpit is entirely digital. Glass screens, software interfaces, real-time trajectory adjustments. Apollo's cockpit was analog. Switches, dials, physical gauges. The astronauts manually read instruments while ground control did most of the heavy mathematics. Orion can, in theory, fly itself. It proved that on Artemis 1 in 2022, when an uncrewed spacecraft completed a full lunar mission and returned to Earth autonomously. That matters more than it sounds. The Apollo astronauts were, in every meaningful sense, passengers on a vehicle that required constant ground control to function. Orion shifts that balance. The Artemis II crew has been performing manual piloting demonstrations in deep space, physically flying the spacecraft, testing steering modes, evaluating how the vehicle handles when a human is actively directing it. This is a spacecraft being designed for a future where astronauts may need to operate completely independently. On the Moon, a communication delay of a few seconds is manageable. On Mars, it can reach 20 minutes. In an emergency, ground control becomes useless. The crew has to be the decision makers. Communication itself has been transformed. Apollo talked to Houston using radio waves, the same basic technology as an AM radio station, just pointed at the moon. It worked, but the audio was scratchy, bandwidth was narrow, and transmitting a single photograph could take minutes. Orion carries that same radio capability as a backup. Its primary system is something else entirely. Laser communications, using infrared light to transmit data back to Earth at rates that would have been unthinkable during Apollo. By the 4th day of the mission, the system had already sent back over 100 gigabytes of data, including high-resolution photographs taken through Orion's windows. Apollo's total data return across an entire mission was measured in megabytes. When Christina Koch looked back at Earth through Orion's window, and that image appeared on screens around the world within hours, that was laser communication doing something radio never could. The views themselves are unlike anything Apollo offered. Every lunar mission in the 1960s and 70s flew approximately 70 miles above the surface. Close enough to see individual craters, close enough to watch the shadow line between lunar day and night crawl across the terrain. Artemis II won't get that close. At its nearest approach during the flyby, Orion will be around 4,000 miles from the surface. A fundamentally different experience. Instead of skimming low over a narrow strip of terrain, the crew will see the entire disk of the moon at once, pole to pole, filling their windows completely. No Apollo astronaut ever had that view. And because of this particular trajectory, the crew will see something no human being has ever seen with their own eyes: the Oriental Basin. A massive impact crater roughly 600 miles across, sitting on the transition zone between the near side and far side of the Moon. Robotic spacecraft have photographed it. Orbital instruments have mapped it. But no person has ever looked at it directly. Apollo missions were planned around a near-side illumination that kept the Oriental region always in shadow or just out of view. Artemis II's trajectory changes that. NASA confirmed the crew has already photographed it through Orion's windows. For the first time, a human being looked at a feature of the Moon that only machines had seen before. There is also a solar eclipse coming. Not the kind seen from Earth, where the Moon blocks the Sun. This one happens when the Earth blocks the Sun, as seen from the spacecraft positioned behind the Moon. It will last approximately 53 minutes, occurring about an hour after Earthrise. No Apollo crew ever saw anything like it. The geometry never aligned. Artemis II's trajectory didn't produce this by design. The physics of the flyby made it inevitable. And the crew and science teams are treating it as an unexpected gift. Imagine watching your home planet, a thin blue crescent, slowly slide in front of the Sun while you float behind the Moon in the deepest silence any human has ever known. Reid Wiseman described the views so far as something no amount of training could have prepared him for. Looking back at Earth during the transit, he could see the entire globe from pole to pole, Africa, Europe, and if he looked closely, the northern lights flickering at the edge of the atmosphere. The flyby views will be something else entirely. Before the mission ends, the crew will also break the record for the farthest any human being has ever traveled from Earth. That record currently belongs to the Apollo 13 crew, and not by choice. Their free return trajectory, forced by an oxygen tank explosion mid-mission, carried them 248,655 miles from home. Artemis II is expected to reach approximately 252,757 miles from Earth. The difference from Apollo 13's record is roughly 4,100 miles. That may not sound like much against 250,000, but the symbolism is everything. Apollo 13 set that record because something went catastrophically wrong. The crew had to survive a slingshot around the Moon in a crippled spacecraft, running on whatever power remained. Artemis II will break it because the mission was designed that way from the beginning. The free return trajectory, using the Moon's gravity to bring the spacecraft home without a major engine burn, was Apollo 13's emergency plan. It is Artemis II's primary flight plan. What was once a desperate last resort is now the architecture of the mission. And at the end of all of it, the crew will face something no human being has ever survived at this speed: re-entry. When Orion hits Earth's atmosphere on the way home, it will be traveling at approximately 25,000 miles per hour. Faster than any crewed spacecraft has ever entered the atmosphere. Faster than Apollo. Faster than the shuttle. Faster than anything. The heat shield will endure temperatures approaching 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit as superheated plasma wraps around the vehicle and cuts all communication. The crew will be completely unreachable for those minutes, unable to talk to Houston, unable to do anything except trust the engineering holding them together. That heat shield carries its own complicated history into this mission. After Artemis I returned in 2022, engineers discovered unexpected erosion in the ablative material. Sections had charred and flaked away in ways the models hadn't predicted. The underlying structure held, the temperatures inside stayed within limits, but the damage was serious enough that NASA convened an independent review team and spent years examining whether the shield was safe to fly with humans aboard. Some engineers objected. Some wanted a redesigned shield before anyone sat on top of it. NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman reviewed the data, consulted engineers and outside experts, and gave the go-ahead. The shield flying on Artemis II is essentially the same design. Changes are planned for Artemis III. The crew knows this. They accepted the risk. Every astronaut who has ever flown has accepted some version of this bargain. The acknowledgement that the engineering is not perfect, that the margins are real but not infinite, and that going anyway is the only way exploration moves forward. The crew itself represents something Apollo never did. Victor Glover is the first person of color to travel beyond low Earth orbit. Christina Koch is the first woman. Jeremy Hansen is the first non-American citizen to go. Apollo was exclusively American, exclusively white, exclusively male. Not because NASA explicitly excluded anyone, but because the pipeline producing military test pilots in the 1960s was itself exclusionary. Artemis 2 doesn't fix that history. Nothing can. But it does mean that the first humans to see the moon up close in more than 50 years look more like the species they represent. There is also a quieter experiment happening inside the cabin. The crew is being monitored for the biological effects of deep space radiation in ways that go far beyond anything Apollo tracked. Dosimeters, sleep analysis, cardiovascular data, all of it recorded to understand what 10 days outside Earth's protective magnetic field does to a human body. In low Earth orbit, that magnetic field deflects most of the dangerous charged particles from deep space, trapping them in concentrated bands called the Van Allen belts. The International Space Station orbits safely below those belts. Every crewed mission since Apollo 17 has stayed below them. The Artemis 2 crew punched through both belts on the way out. They will punch through them again on the way home. Apollo astronauts did the same, but the medical monitoring was primitive by comparison. Some Apollo crews reported seeing flashes of light with their eyes closed, cosmic rays striking their retinas directly. We understand what causes those flashes now. We know the risks are real and cumulative. The data this mission collects will shape crew selection and mission duration limits for every deep space program that follows. Right now, 4 people are in deep space simultaneously. That is the most humans beyond low Earth orbit at the same time in the history of our species. They are eating rehydrated meals from a food warmer the size of a briefcase. They are sleeping in bags attached to the walls of a cabin not much larger than a walk-in closet. They are exercising on a 30-pound yo-yo. They have already seen parts of the moon that no living person has ever seen. And by tomorrow, they will have traveled farther from Earth than any human being who came before them. And they are doing all of it in a spacecraft that is, if we are being honest, still a capsule. Bigger than Apollo. Smarter than Apollo, better equipped, better connected, better in almost every measurable way, but still a capsule, still a metal shell with a heat shield at the bottom and a parachute system at the top, designed to keep 4 people alive in the most hostile environment human beings have ever entered. The fundamental engineering problem hasn't changed since 1968. You need air, water, food, thermal control, radiation shielding, a way to decelerate, and a way to survive the landing. 53 years of progress have made every one of those systems lighter, faster, and more reliable. They have not made any of them easy. The Artemis 2 crew is expected to splash down in the Pacific Ocean around April 11th. Recovery ships will be waiting. Airbags will inflate around the capsule to right it if it lands sideways or inverted, another feature Apollo never had. Divers will approach the bobbing spacecraft, open the hatch, and help 4 people climb out into the sunlight. Those 4 people will have completed the first crewed mission beyond Earth orbit in more than half a century. They will have tested every system that future crews will depend on to actually land on the moon. They will have seen things that change how you understand your own planet, your own smallness, your own extraordinary luck at being alive on the one rock in the solar system where you can simply breathe outside. When the Apollo astronauts came home, they came home as conquerors. The moon had been the target, and they hit it. When the Artemis 2 crew comes home, they will come home as pathfinders. The moon is no longer the destination. It is the first stop. Everything this crew is testing, the life support, the navigation, the heat shield, the communications, the exercise equipment, the toilet, is being validated not just for lunar missions, but for the journey that comes after. Mars. Orion has already been evaluated for a 1,000-day mission profile when paired with additional habitation modules. The data this crew is generating right now, how their bodies respond to deep space radiation, how they sleep, how their cardiovascular systems adapt, will directly shape the spacecraft and mission architecture that eventually sends the first humans to another planet. Apollo proved we could leave. Artemis is figuring out how to stay gone. Right now, 4 human beings are closer to the moon than anyone has been since December 1972. They are looking through windows that are larger and clearer than anything Apollo offered. They are transmitting images home at speeds that make Apollo's radio look like smoke signals. They are flying a spacecraft that can navigate autonomously, built partly from 3D printed components, powered by the sun, carrying the lessons of 53 years of trial and error. Lessons paid for in failure, patience, money, and time. They are not repeating what Apollo did. They are picking up a thread that was dropped in 1972, pulling it forward, and weaving something new. And tomorrow, they fly behind the moon. For 40 minutes, no signal will reach them. No voice from Earth. No data link. No connection to anything human except the 3 other people floating beside them in a capsule 250,000 miles from home. The Apollo astronauts knew that silence too. It is the one experience that hasn't changed. The moon still blocks the signal. The void is still the void. And for those 40 minutes, the Artemis II crew will understand something that no amount of technology can mediate. The ancient, irreducible fact of being alone in the dark. Farther from home than any road or wire or beam of light can follow. That silence is the same. Everything else is new.